Unfiltered. I'm your host, Sizwe Mpofu Walsh. As South Africa marks Heritage Month, the plight of the Khoi-San community and other marginalized groups remains a cause for concern. From allegations of discrimination, inadequate delivery of services, and landlessness, these communities seem to be at the receiving end of the country's myriad problems. This despite efforts by government and relevant departments to address these challenges. Tonight we ask, who is South Africa's First Nation and how can they be incorporated into our democratic framework? To help us unpack the topic, I'm joined in studio by Kgosi Thabo Seatlholo, who is the chairperson of the National House of Traditional and Khoi-San Leaders, as well as Khwe activist Mr. Neville Felix. Joining me virtually as well is the chairperson of the National Khoi-San Council, Mr. Cecil le Fleur. But first, let's have a look at this insert produced by Andrew Mogatle.
You must know already that there is a bill that has been approved by the National Assembly that gives recognition to the Khoi-San. Yes, but also to the heritage of the Khoi-San. So that bill is now before Parliament. It's now going to the National Council of Provinces. It will be passed, and in the end we will set up a commission that will do precisely what the Nthapo Commission did with the traditional leadership of all our other people in the country.
A message to the Khoi-San people from then Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa on Christmas Eve in 2017. 6 years later, the struggle for recognition by this community and other so-called minority groups seems far from over. According to South African History Online, the Khoi were the first indigenous people to come into contact with Dutch settlers in the mid-17th century. During the dark days of apartheid, the Khoi-San remained socially and politically marginalized and classified as coloureds, with Afrikaans being their primary language. There is no clear data about the official number of the Khoi-San people currently residing in South Africa. In an effort to address issues of leadership within these groups, the National Council of Provinces passed the Traditional and Khoi-San Leadership Bill in 2019. During the opening of the National House of Traditional and Khoi-San Leaders in February this year, President Ramaphosa sought to allay concerns around traditional and Khoi-San leadership.
We have made good progress in creating a sound legal basis for the institution of traditional and Khoi-San leadership to function. The Traditional and Khoi-San Leadership Act has now been signed into law. To give effect to this provision, government has appointed a commission on Khoi-San matters, and the commission is currently receiving applications for recognition.
The Traditional and Khoi-San Leadership Act hit a snag in May this year when the Constitutional Court declared it unconstitutional and invalid.
And the third is
in a unanimous judgment, the highest court in the land ruled that Parliament overwhelmingly failed in facilitating public participation. The declaration of invalidity was suspended for a period of 24 months to allow Parliament to re-enact the legislation in a manner that is consistent with the Constitution. In 2017, the Khoi-San community led by Mr. Khoi-San SA presented a memorandum of demands to the presidency. Among others, they called for the recognition of the Khoi-San First Nation status and the land to be given back to their rightful owners, who, according to them, are the Khoi-San. In 2019, government and the Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries announced the launch of the benefit sharing agreement on traditional knowledge associated with rooibos tea. The agreement stipulates that the exploitation and commercialization by the rooibos industry should come with adequate compensation. In 2022, the industry paid out 12.2 million rand to the Khoi-San community. Andrew Mokhatle, Unfiltered, SABC News.
Welcome back to Unfiltered, and let's commence with our panel discussion this evening. Mr. Felix, could you distill the quest for recognition of the Khoi-San community in South Africa and its importance?
Yes, Mr. Welch. I shall try my best to put the foundation. Firstly, we, as the Khwe and the Tham nation, and I'm not talking about the little branches that came from this foundation seed, I'm speaking about the foundation seed of the First Nation people in South Africa, has been part of Africa all along, long for thousands of years, long before colonialization happened, long before Bartholomew Dias arrived in 1488. In fact, we even have history of General Zheng of China that parted with us in the 13th century. So historically, I find it very difficult to speak about recognition. Is it not maybe denialism that we need to talk about? Because how do you recognize something that is a foundation of all of humanity? And that is the problem that we have in South Africa today, and I want to place it on record, that we had an unstructured governance system since 1652 when Van Riebeeck, Antonio, Johannes arrived here. It continued to be unstructured when the Prince of Orange sold all of us off for £6 million to the British in 1795. And when the British took us over, we tried to reinvent ourselves through many, many issues. And what a lot of people don't know, and it's very sad history that we all from that foundation people, because we don't know color.
Do you think the democratic government has continued that trend of de-recognition? I mean, the colonial era is well documented. But what are your particular concerns with the way that the democratic order has...
Yeah, completely. Look, it is the Westminster system that is still in charge. It is an unstructured governance system that is still here since 1652 because it carries the same foundations. It creates us as otherism. You that, I'm this, you that. So we can't be a nation if you don't resolve the one fundamental question, and to the government itself, it has failed to resolve the national question. So I would like to leave it at that and give you more information as we move along. I'm just putting the baseline.
Absolutely.
But before I release you, I would be doing a disservice to my nation and to our people if I don't honor a very fundamental person here tonight. And this is in honor of Dr. Leonard Martin, the late Dr. Leonard Martin. We as the First Nation people would like to give recognition for the fundamental role that he has played in trying to put our discourse in justice back into the process of society. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. You've laid out a set of very interesting questions that we'll delve into as the show unfolds. Mr. Le Fleur, can I ask you to respond to the same question that I put to Mr. Felix, and do you agree that, in fact, even the language of recognition is the wrong way to come at this problem, that the Khoi-San community in its myriad forms has been overlooked in the democratic dispensation?
Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Sorry, Mr. Le Fleur, we're just struggling to hear you. We're going to just work on that connection, and we will come back to you. But apologies for the technical glitch.
Okay.
Kgosi Seatlholo, thank you very much for joining us. some leaders within the Khoi-San community have observed a tension between trying to incorporate questions of Khoi-San and indigenous leadership along with questions of traditional leadership. They see these as two different branches of South African governance. Do you think there's a tension between recognizing Khoi-San leadership and traditional leadership within the same institutions and the same laws?
Good evening. Well, not necessarily. I mean, the struggle for recognition of Khoi-San communities, we have carried it jointly with them as traditional leaders for as long as we've existed. You know, as they have been pursuing this and we've been doing it jointly with them. Any platform that we get, perhaps to speak to the president or government in whatever platform, I think our responsibility and our contribution to the struggle, more than anything, has been making sure that we give them a formal space, because we are formalized already as traditional communities and traditional leaders. When we open the house, we make sure that they are there, we make sure they speak to the president, they relay the issues, but we do not only do that, we also give support, in lawmaking and everything. So there could be here and there, but it's nothing that could be so serious.
Absolutely, and Mr. Le Fleur, we've got you back. Could I ask you to reflect on that question that I put to you earlier about the extent to which you can distill the long-standing quest for greater recognition of Khoi-San communities in South Africa?
Yeah, thank you for having me. And for us as the Khoi-San people, we had been fighting this battle for many, many years. And we came forward in 1995, shortly after the new dispensation in South Africa. And we tried to persuade our new liberal government to recognize the Khoi and San people as they recognize the other traditional leaders and traditional communities in the country. We had a little bit of a battle at that time, because they said that they cannot do that because we don't have land anymore. We don't have villages where we practice our cultures and traditions. And that inspired us to go to the international arena in the United Nations. And we'd been there for 1995, 1996, 1997, and in 1997, the then President Mandela, for the first time, commissioned his Deputy General or Director General to meet with us in Beaufort West. And at that time, it was the Griqua people, because we are different groupings within and under the umbrella of the term Khoi-San or Khoi. So under the Khoi, we have 4 groupings. That is the Griqua, the Kurana, the Nama, and the Cape Khoi group. And so all of them, and then of course, the San people, which also form part of the struggle.
Can I ask you, Mr. Le Fleur, on that, coming to the present particularly, how do you feel that the present democratic framework is successfully or unsuccessfully dealing with some of the questions that you have put on the table about greater recognition and incorporation of these Khoi-San groups and communities now and today?
Yeah, if we must go to that, I can mention that the Act, the Traditional and Khoi-San Leadership Act, recognize the Khoi and San people and their communities and their leadership structures. Unfortunately, as we had seen in the inset earlier, that act is at the moment back in Parliament, and we hope that it will be rectified as soon as possible. But we were assured that the process of recognition is going on, irrespective of the fact that the Act was sent back to Parliament.
Indeed,
but,
right. Let me stop you there, Mr. Le Fleur. I will come back to you. But Mr. Felix, anything you'd like to add before we go to break? I see you've been taking in the various...
Yes, I'm so glad that
we have a few
here.
minutes to break, so
Okay.
if you can be brief, and then we will come back for a wider discussion.
First of all, I think we are dealing with it in an unstructured way, and in all due respect to everybody that is here, history is not everybody's forte. Now, the German anthropologist that gave this name called Khoi-San, a German anthropologist, in 1928 gave us the name Khoi-San. But Jan Antonius van Riebeeck, born in Brazil, which you didn't know, that came here in 1652 under the VOC. In his 3 diaries, and I'd advise you to look up at that 3 diaries. You can get it on Google. Google is such a wonderful thing if you
So
didn't
do you have a
research.
specific problem with the name?
Yes. When Jan van Riebeeck asked us, our descendants, who are we? We responded to him and said, we are the Songkhwais. That's what we told him. And they then decided to do replacement ideology and give us all different types of names, including the other names that has been given to the different things. You will see it has been people that is from the European descent that came into the missionary schools and renamed this one, renamed that one. So they have stolen the identity of the indigenous people and communities of this country. And I'll tell you the reason why, Mpo. The meaning of the name Songkhwais means the meaning. And I want everyone in South Africa to hear, because it's so wonderful, it's their foundation. The meaning of Songkhwais means supreme beings, which reinforces the concept idea that all humanity has originated from us.
Right, and let's leave it there before we
you.
go to our break. We're going to come back and explore this conversation over traditional leadership in South Africa and also recognition of what many and our South African legislation call the Khoi-San community. Of course, there are discrepancies and divisions over exactly the words that should be used, and we'll delve into some of those questions and questions of identity too. But stick with us. We'll be back after the break to inquire into those conversations. Welcome back to Unfiltered. We're discussing questions of the recognition of the Khoi-San community in South Africa. Can we come, Kgosi Seatlholo, to the Traditional and Khoi-San Leadership Bill, because this recently went to the Constitutional Court. There's been a big push for the legal recognition of Khoi-San leaders, and this bill has been struck down to the extent that it wasn't participatory enough in the public participation sections, and also there were concerns about the accountability of leaders. What was your and what is your current view on the fact that the Constitutional Court has described this law as unconstitutional in its current form, and where do we go from here with this bill?
Look, it's a serious drawback, particularly for the Khoi-San community, because it's the only legal instrument that it's available so that they can be recognized as communities, but also as leaders. But I think we've got a reprieve from the Constitutional Court to say, we suspend this for 24 months. Parliament go and correct the concern which is not participatory sufficiently. I think we are also pushing Parliament and government to do that, so we don't find ourselves being in a position whereby we've got no legal instrument to recognize that.
Are you confident that Parliament will be able to rise to that challenge?
Not really. Yeah, not really.
Well, fair enough. Short and sweet.
Yeah.
Mr. Le Fleur, what are your thoughts on the bill, the declaration of unconstitutionality, and where we go from here? Because the Constitutional Court's reservations are quite serious about there not being enough public participation. I think they said in section 24 of this proposed bill that, the leaders envisaged within this bill could enter into partnership agreements virtually without any consultation with the communities of people who actually live on this important land. Those are quite serious charges of this bill.
Yeah, we were very disappointed when this happened because, as alluded to by the chair of the National House, we had been knocking at the door for almost 30 years now. And the moment we got this bill that gives some recognition to the Khoi and San people, and I must say here that the Khoi and San people are not really satisfied with the bill as it stands, but it was a first step on the ladder and for recognition. So we felt very disappointed when this bill or this act was sent to the Constitutional Court, and now we are waiting for the outcome, and we are also doubtful if Parliament will react and rectify the things that they did wrong within 24 months, because we have the general election in front of us, and we know that Parliament will close one other time in the near future, and that will mean that there will be a lot of delays. But we were also told that the issues that were raised in court in relation to the Act did not really affect us as Khoi-San people. It was not areas in the Act that Khoi-San people are directly involved in. And that is what makes us more disappointed, because now we must wait for another 2 years, and most probably more than 3 years. And in the meantime, the National House and the different traditional councils under the auspices of that house will carry on
Right.
Act 41.
Let me come to Mr. Felix on this. What are your thoughts on the declaration of unconstitutionality and where we go from here with this important piece of legislation?
Thank you, Cecil, and my apology for calling you almost a replacement ideology by giving you the wrong name. So my apology.
Not at all.
When it comes to the legislation, this subordinate legislation you're referring to, which is part of the supreme law of this country, Act 108 of 1996 being the supreme law of the country, there is definitely a conflict of interest. And let me spell it out to you.
Sure.
If you look at the preamble of the very constitution that we're speaking to, the preamble, right in the beginning, it speaks about what the objective is of this democracy and what we're trying to put in place. And if one look, and I want to agree with the Chief here as well as Mr. Le Fleur, that there has been a failure to completely address the most fundamental process of the social injustices of the past. So, you know, there's an old African tale, and I'd like to bring you to that. They say, until the lion tells the story of the hunt, you will only have his story of the hunter. And that's the unfortunate problem that we have here in South Africa.
So you think the Constitution itself doesn't grapple deeply enough with the question of the communities that you believe
Absolutely.
need this?
I want to tell you that, and what I'm about to say will put it into its proper perspective.
And which parts of the Constitution do you take issue with?
Well, basically, Chapter 14 of the Constitution, Section 1, 2, 3, 1, 3, 2, 3, 4, 5, all of those sections speaks about the perfect position that the South African government finds itself in to give effect to these processes.
Yeah.
But the challenge that we have is when you start anything, says where you must fix the foundation. You can't come afterwards as an afterthought and want to fix the foundation. Then it means you're building on the wrong foundation.
It's interesting, and we will come back to you, Mr. Felix. I apologize. We're just the names tonight. But Kgosi Seatlholo, what do you make of this argument that, in fact, before we even get to the traditional and Khoi-San leadership bill, there's actually a constitutional problem here in terms of the way the Constitution envisages and incorporates traditional leadership and also questions of the Khoi-San community?
I think, you know, the reality of what he's saying is true to a certain degree. If you look at how the Constitution addresses indigenous people, it sort of put them at the back and say, we are now in a democratic system, therefore your right to practice your culture and all of that should be very limited. So a lot of our powers as communities and community leaders have been taken away by the Constitution. So he's actually quite correct, and that needs to be sorted.
There are some constitutional provisions that do guarantee cultural rights. Of course, this is in the Bill of Rights as well. Mr. le Fleur, what are your thoughts on this? Because, of course, the constitutional drafters had a difficult balance to tread here between, on the one hand, building a new democratic country, and on the other hand, recognizing various and diverse cultural groups. What are your thoughts on the constitutional question?
Yeah, I agree with my two fellow participants that there's a lot of shortfalls in the Constitution. The Constitution, for instance, in terms of the Khoi-San people, only mention their right to preserve and develop their languages. The Constitution make no other provision directly for indigenous peoples and Khoi and San peoples per se. And the new act also don't address the issue of indigenous peoples. And we have a big problem with that, because we are convinced that nobody can deny that the Khoi and the San are the descendants of the very first people, as alluded to by Mr. Felix, that ever occupied Southern Africa. So we feel that the bill, whilst it is sent back to Parliament, must look, the people in Parliament must look at the shortfalls in the Constitution and rectify that alongside with the better consultation processes, so that we in the end can get a much better product that can assure the recognition of Khoi and San people.
Let me come to Mr. Felix then. I guess one of the worries from an outside perspective, especially not only in terms of the Constitution but also this proposed bill, is when you give authority and power to new leaders, what happens to the communities that they claim leadership over? And it seems that this bill at the moment isn't actually benefiting those communities, at least to the extent that they aren't required to be consulted when big and financially lucrative decisions can be made over their land. Is there not a worry here that people are marshalling culture and history ultimately for their own private ends?
Absolutely, Sizwe, you are 150% correct. Let me just place it into its proper perspective, and I'd even speak to the Traditional Leaders Act 41 of 2003 and where it actually all falls short. We need to understand that the Constitution is a product of an agreement between white political parties that had a referendum to talk to some of our leadership in the political sphere. And the unfortunate part is that we were not represented at CODESA 1 or 2 at all as the people. They went there with their own mind to go and decide on what. So if you look at the foundation of the Constitution and the CODESA process itself, I normally refer to it as an unstructured consensus. It's exactly the same process that was brought in by the colonialist, both the English and the Dutch, in 1948, when South Africa could have adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It decided to turn right and implement apartheid in this country and put us back a whole period of processes. So we need to understand that if, you know, when you listen to people like Winston Churchill, when they asked him a question after World War II, and he responded by saying, the further back in history you go, the more clearer the truth becomes.
Right.
And I'd like it to hang it at that, and I'll answer some more questions as we continue.
Indeed, and Kgosi Seatlholo,
I find it so important.
No, indeed, and I think this is a question of marking particular points in history. But we haven't figured out this question of land rights and the appropriate relationship between traditional leadership and authority that everyone mostly recognizes as existing, but on the other hand, making sure that the communities and the people who are subject to that authority also benefit. Do you have any thoughts on this in terms of particularly this current act? Because that seems to have been a problem, that the people on the land didn't even need to be consulted if there was going to be a partnership agreement about that land.
I think that statement is not entirely true, but also what is being said there, you can tell that these people, they do not understand African culture. The word that is usually used in the political circles to say we are going to Lekgotla, it talks about us and how we take decisions as African people. You do not just wake up as Kgosi and say you are taking a decision that these people can come here and mine. In fact, that is even too much. Any kind of decision that will impact on the people, you need to consult, because the purpose of Khotla is for people to come there every day and deliberate on the issues.
But don't we have a case of traditional leadership where some 5 billion rand eventually went
No,
missing?
that is allegations, and in any case, even if it was there, you cannot take an isolated matter and make it as if it's a norm of the institution, that wherever traditional leaders are, they are signing 5 billion rent.
But how do we guard against that? I think that's probably what the court was trying to
That should be addressed in law. But more importantly, what we need to address is the cut-off date of the 1913. Because remember, the Khoisans were the first people to be affected by the dispossession of land. So if you use 1913 as a cut-off date, it means all of them, but not only the Khoisans, even, you know, the Xhosa frontier wars and all of that, they were fought in the 1800s. So what the Constitutional Court and Parliament needs to correct is to make sure that the 1913 cut-off date is out, so that the Khoi-San people and other African nations can claim their land back.
Let's go to a break. We're discussing vexed historical questions about the appropriate and adequate recognition of South Africa's indigenous communities. Don't go anywhere. After the break, we come back to discuss questions of the institutions we have set up to deal with these questions and whether they're working or not, and also questions of identity and language. Stick with us. Welcome back to Unfiltered. We're asking questions about South Africa's indigenous communities, how they should be appropriately recognized within our democratic framework, whether we've got that right over the last 30 odd years of our democracy, and if not, how we can do that. Our panel is throwing up a series of fascinating and interesting questions and insights. Mr. Le Fleur, I want to come to you, and I want to ask you about the institutions we have set up as a country that are responsible for dealing with these questions of indigenous communities, traditional leadership, and the intersection between the two. How do you think the National Khoi-San Council has functioned, and what do you think its strengths and weaknesses are? Do you think that's an effective institution? If not, how would you change it? If so, why is it effective?
I think the National Khoi-San Council served a good purpose because during the time that, and that was just after 1994, that there was not a well-organized structure to represent Khoi-San people in the country. We started the National Khoi-San Council, and over time it evolved and include much more groupings than initially were included. And so the National Khoi-San Council were given the opportunity to represent and to act as a mouthpiece between the Khoi-San people on the one hand and the government on the other hand. Of course, we don't reckon that the National Khoi-San Council is the ideal vehicle to do this negotiations in its current form, and we would really like to see a much stronger body that can and have much more powers to deal with this very sensitive issue.
Right. Let me put that. I will come back to you, Mr. Le Fleur, but let me put that to Mr. Felix. Your thoughts on this particular body and its strengths and weaknesses as an institution, the National Khoi-San Council?
I hear you, Cecil, and I hear Mr. Le Fleur. And I think one of the good things that we have in common is the right to agree, to disagree, because that strengthens each other. Remember, iron sharpens iron. Look, in my opinion, the Khoi-San National Council that was set up at Kimberley 1 and 2 and through Madiba and so forth, originally the first minister was Sidney Mufamadi. And Sidney Mufamadi said that they need a different dispensation to deal with the so-called, and I say so-called because I know who I am. I don't need to be recognized by nobody else because I am an indigenous son of the soil, and therefore I carry in my DNA the sovereignty and indigeneity that we all carry.
How would you strengthen the council? What institutional?
We have just launched on Sunday past, on the 24th of September, in Cape Town at the castle where our problems all started. We have launched the Elke Bolan Restorative Reservoir of Wisdom, Circle of Elders Council, just a concept idea, and now we need to pull everybody else in so that we restructure ourselves to go and resolve the problems of who we are. So we don't need recognition of who we are. We are sovereign people. And now everybody that's born here is indigenous to our country of origin. So it's very important that we note that.
Indeed. Kgosi Seatlholo, the National House, which you lead, what do you make of the effectiveness of that institution? What do you think its strengths have been? What things frustrate you about it now that you've taken over the leadership of it that could be improved?
Look, there's a couple of strengths there. We in terms of legislation, we've got a direct communication with all levels of government, from the ward councillor to the president. We are able to speak to them, to advocate for issues of rural people and indigenous people in general. But there are weaknesses in the system. From a budgetary perspective, very little you can do. Staffing, human resources is highly constrained, and many other issues. So there are weaknesses. However, because it's the National House, we have been working with the Khoi-San community generally. And maybe it's not their fault, but it's a weakness that is there, and it's delaying the progress. Maybe what has been achieved could have been achieved much earlier. There are too many groupings amongst themselves, where these ones call themselves this and this one, and they are always fighting amongst themselves. If we can try and work on that, where you find, because we engage with them a lot, you find that from Eastern Cape there are so many groups and they are disagreeing amongst themselves on the name, on the content and all of that. But I think it's an advice to them who are here and those who are watching at home, if they can just minimize those things, because that is when again you find that government takes much longer, because this group will say this and maybe government tries to listen to that, then another group will say no, they don't even represent us, those people, we are the legitimate ones. So if we can work around that, I think things will move much quicker.
Mr. Le Fleur, infighting seems to have in some ways hampered this historical call. What do you make of those observations from Kgosi Seatlholo?
I think I cannot deny that there are this type of divisions amongst our different Khoi-San groupings. But for a people to revive almost from scratch, it tends to be a normal evolution, that there will be this type of struggles among each other and etc. And I, as one of the leaders who started the fight for recognition of the Khoi-San people in the country, I'm not happy with that divisions and that competition and that denialism of different leadership structures and etc. But I think we must keep in mind that we will take time to build one strong, unified structure that can fight for the rights of indigenous peoples and specifically Khoi-San peoples in this country, because it will be a battle that will go on for many, many years in future. So we must address that issue. I agree with my leader, chairperson of our National House, but we must also not allow that government use this against us, because there's division all over in government structures, in party structures. All over you get these divisions and forming of new groupings and the same trend. So we must not use that as an excuse to address the issues of the Khoi-San people.
Right.
On the other hand,
let me come then, because I think we have traversed the institutional questions, to maybe a deeper question, which has always been at the center of this political movement, which is the question of language. And I think something that interests me, and maybe I hadn't even thought about, was when you look at the language and linguistic recognition in South Africa and the 11 official languages. Of course, it's been a long-standing call that languages that are indigenous to South Africa have been erased in that process. What are your thoughts on this question of linguistic erasure and how that has worked both before but even after the new constitution?
Thank you, Sizwe. What a wonderful question that you've raised, because it's at the heartbeat of what creates division amongst all indigenous people in our country of origin. Now, we need to recognize that we cannot speak about the first language and make it the 12th one or the 13th one. It means it needs to be the foundation language. And if you look at the Xhosa people, the 4 clicks in their language is taken from Khwe, Nama Khwe. The 3 clicks in the Zulu language also comes from the indigenous language, which means we are all indigenous people. And it's time that we recognize that you need to put your foundation in place. So it's not new groupings or new people that is rising. What is happening today, as truth starts to become more prevalent, we need to understand, in my earlier statement, when I said, until the lion tells the story of the hunt, you will only have the history of the hunter who actually came and disturbed Africa with a gun. Okay? So when it comes to the issues, the reason why we are having these problems, because you cannot do things in reverse gear. So we are suffering as a people for 371 years. It's not a new struggle. It is the only struggle. For 371 years, counting from the 6th of April 1652 to where we are now.
What kind of changes would you like to see in language recognition?
First of all, language recognition is one of the cultural aspects that becomes important. It would also help us to put the baseline of who we are as a nation people. Pink, white, purple, blue, chocolate and khaki, all the colors. So remember, Madiba wanted to establish a rainbow nation. But unfortunately, we ended up with a situation that has been negligible of putting in place the correct process, methodologies to take us forward as a collective nation. And I think we all have the same problem. All of us, because we have been all dispossessed. The whole of Africa was colonized, and even up till today, they continue to live off our resources.
Seatlholo on that, because I see you agreeing there with Mr. Felix. Your response to this question of language recognition and maybe some of the insights that you've gained on how we can engender further recognition of the diverse cultural heritage of our country.
Look, it's a huge injustice to the Khoi-San community for non-recognition. 30 years later, it should have been done immediately with all other communities. And that contributes to the identity crisis that we find ourselves in, even amongst ourselves, because how we describe ourselves, we describe ourselves through the colonial terms. From those anthropologists, you'll hear people saying Sotho Tswana groups, but what is Sotho Tswana groups, and what is Sotho or Tswana? This is Tswana or this is Sotho. There's no Sotho or Tswana. So if you look at how we are classified currently, we are classified through the colonial terms, and it's I think it's part of what the preamble of the Constitution is saying, to say we recognize the injustice of the past. But if you recognize it and you don't fix it, then you might as well have not said anything. Because as Khoi-San communities, we are here. Our languages are not recognized, but the Constitution in its preamble is saying you recognize. Therefore, what is being said there is meaningless to us as indigenous communities. Hence, earlier on we said we've got issues with the Constitution itself.
Mr. Le Fleur, your thoughts on this question of language and any proposals from your side on how it could be better incorporated into South Africa's democracy and our cultural landscape There are just very few places in our country where we get to experience the wisdom and the linguistic diversity that is obviously still present in our country within Khoi-San communities.
Yeah, I cannot agree more with Kgosi Seatlholo and Mr. Felix on the language issue. I totally agree with them. And what is the reality is that the Khoi-San languages are being destroyed in South Africa over time. And our youth is not connected to that languages anymore. So for us, that is one of the reasons why colonialism and apartheid could so easily destroy our identity, because they destroyed our languages and our cultural identity and etc. But building and rebuilding and restoring the languages will be a huge task. But the Council is busy working on that at the moment. But by far, I think it is not adequate, the effort that they put into restoring these languages. And I agree that the first languages that were spoken in this country, in the valleys and in the mountains of this country, was the Khoi-San languages. And so it should be a pride for the whole of South Africa to work together to restore and rebuild some of these Khoi-San languages.
And we'll have to leave it there, I'm afraid, because we've run out of time. But Mr. Le Fleur, thank you so much. Kgosi Seatlholo, we really appreciate your time. And Mr. Felix, thank you very much. Thank you for joining us on another episode of Unfiltered Views, Unfiltered News, and Unfiltered Conversations. Tonight, as we wrap up our Heritage Day theme, we have inquired into the question of how we appropriately recognize the various indigenous communities of our land, their language, but also how we create a democratic framework which successfully incorporates groups who feel marginalized from the South African project back into its center from the margins. Let's continue this conversation on social media at Unfiltered SABC, and have a good night.